Hello and welcome to the last lecture in crisis intervention. As we are on chapter 12, reminder after this, you will be moving on to the CPI training. You cannot miss either day of the CPI training. If you do, I cannot issue a certificate from CPI. Um, and also, as a note, just a reminder, since we are completing chapter 12, that means all of the assessment material throughout the course has led to this final chapter. Um, and upon completion, you will know what your final grade is in the course. CPI is separate from the grading, it's not a graded component. So let's talk about crisis and reaction to serious illness and disabilities. I like to think of these things through the social work lens of person and environment, in that there is a constant interchange between the individual and those things that they bring to bear, like any medical conditions, stressors, family situation, a constant transaction with their environment, which includes the family milieu, the neighborhood, supports that are available or not available, and that this is something that occurs over the course of one's lifespan. So by the time that you're working with someone, it very well may be that they've had a lot of things stacked up both internally and externally against them. Um, let's start with palliative care. Palliative care is primarily a focus on a reduction of severity of symptoms rather than curative. It's to prevent and relieve suffering, improve quality of life, whereas hospice care, think of that as palliative care for those at the end of life. There is a lot of work in the field of social work, medical social work, and human services for those in gerontology or in hospice. So another thing in terms of your occupation that you can consider how to apply this information. We'll start with AIDS and HIV. There's been a steady decline in the diagnosis over the past 40 years, except in certain groups. Uh, African Americans, 51%, whites, 29%, and Latino, 18%. Latino men make up 79% of new HIV cases. Uh, a few things that are going on too. People are living a lot longer, a decade or more, with all the medication interventions that we've developed. And even some research has been able to see what seems like we can prevent the transmission of AIDS to children when their mother has AIDS. So now we're shifting into this uh, era of people dying with AIDS versus living with HIV. So it's becoming something manageable, something that people can live long term with. However, there are, some medical complications and physical complications that can go along with this as well. AIDS develops when HIV invades and disrupts the immune system. And remember that these are considered two different things. So when HIV, when someone uh, has HIV, there's this infection, the acuity and symptoms. They can develop the uh, medical conditions that lead to a diagnosis of AIDS. So HIV does occur before AIDS, and I think at this point we're all kind of aware of this, but 20, 30 years ago, very different. Some misconceptions about AIDS, and I'm hoping that we all know these by now, right? AIDS can be spread by kissing? False. AIDS can be spread by touching? False. It can be spread by sharing utensils? Also false. And a person can contract AIDS by being near someone with it? Absolutely not. This is not how it works. How it does work is it's person to person transmission through sexual behavior involving an exchange of body fluids, the use of HIV contaminated injection equipment, by more than one person involving the exchange of blood. So some of the modes: mother to infant, during pregnancy, labor, delivery, breastfeeding, transfusion, of course, or contact with infected feces that enters the bloodstream. So some of the treatments that have come up, we've got this, they call it the triple whammy, where they use these three different medications, AZT. These were used in isolation at first, and then over time, finding that the three of them together is a pretty nice cocktail of preventing the furtherance of HIV in the body. It's really been quite astonishing and amazing in terms of the treatment approaches, where now we have people, like I said earlier, who are living longer and fuller lives through this treatment. How do we reduce the risk? Of course, again, I'm not teaching a sex ed class. I think you guys understand how this works. Safe sex, condoms, yada, yada, yada. There you go. Uh, this is, if I again, hoping that you're aware of this coming straight from the text. But the reason that I'm presenting this is because this is educational material that you would use with a client, and those could be teens in particular, or adults who are just not aware of what HIV/AIDS is, and how there is much more common knowledge about how it's transmitted and how to prevent it and also intervene when one has it. So, a couple of the issues that people who have HIV and AIDS, or AIDS, I should say not or AIDS, yes, or AIDS, deal with, there's some similarities and differences. On the one hand, people with HIV feel like they may have a death sentence going on. They don't want to tell anyone, change their lifestyle. Of course, if they need or want help, medication is the number one intervention, and people being medication compliant can be an issue. Of course, suicide can be a part of this because of obvious, shocking information that you find out about having this illness, and the sort of the stigma that goes along with it, that you'll never get better, never be well, that it's the end of your life. Whereas AIDS, those folks may be struggling more with death and dying issues. There may be more medical care issues or financial problems, and of course, caretaker issues. As of just a couple years ago, the CDC reported that 1.2 million people were living with HIV. The largest group of those are aged between 30 and 34. We have seen a little bit of a reduction over the course of time, of course, with education around prevention and treatment. African Americans have the highest rates. And the other thing about HIV is that those folks are in the studies, now this is a broad range, 7 to 36 times higher risk of suicide than the general population. In terms of interventions, there are a lot of assumptions that are based on religious perspectives that are not accurate in terms of considering people's quote unquote lifestyle. So watch your assumptions, watch your bias, and understand the reality and the science behind this sort of stuff. There's a lot of medical interventions that are very helpful. And we don't always get to pick and choose who our clients will be. So you should be aware of this and should know how to intervene. So interventions with HIV, education, of course, suicide prevention, looking at maybe groups where there are folks who have been living with HIV, and to show them that there is life after HIV or with HIV. Of course, medication related interventions. There can be cultural implications to this too, in terms of the impact it might have on how one sees their family name, or how their family treats them. And with AIDS, grief therapy Case management, of course. By the way, case management being probably one of the most important interventions we can offer to people. I know I've worked at plenty of places where I felt like the case manager could, like out of 100, could provide 90% of the things that the client needed, and therapy provided a little bit of support, but case managers really do save the world. So I don't want anybody to like look down upon someone who's a professional case manager. They do some serious business. Of course, someone with AIDS, they may want to be you may want to have them on a suicide watch, and also making sure that there is medication compliance. And again, getting back into this idea of support groups as well as the possibility of hospice care. Sexually transmitted infections. When I went to school, they were called STDs. They are not diseases, they are infections. So they're called STIs. So the most common are chlamydia and gonorrhea. Syphilis has increased among man to man sex. Herpes, genital warts must also be considered within this group of STIs. It's kind of a weird jump to go from STIs to Alzheimer's disease, isn't it? I must have had something else to say about this, but apparently I don't. That you can't read in the text, I suppose. So let's move on to Alzheimer's then. Okay, so this disease is expected to increase over time as we have an aging population. In fact, over 50% of those who are 85 and older have it. Um, Older Latinos are 1 to 1.5 times more likely than whites to have it, and older African Americans are 2 times more likely to have it. Um, Oftentimes in these populations, you'll see higher rates of vascular disease, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, diabetes, heart disease. And we also know that it is the sixth leading cause of death in the United States. It's progressive, it's degenerative, it doesn't go away. At least at this point, we don't have a good way to make it go away. We don't have good intervention. It attacks the brain, it impairs memory, thinking, and behavior. Um, and you will see a difference in how someone manifests it in the early stages versus the late stages. It has an incredible impact on caretakers, and I'm sure all of us knows or knows of someone who's either been a caretaker or maybe you've experienced Alzheimer's firsthand through family members. And caretakers, I saw this firsthand with my dad, a lot of anxiety trying to take care of. There was this neighbor who was very close with our family, and he spent the last like 10 years of her life really kind of being her one on one aide, a lot of times in her house, and then eventually moving her into like his basement before succumbing to all the exhaustion um, that he was able to finally get her into a place that was very helpful, providing around the clock care. So you can find a good deal of emotional upheaval for those people who are providing care for the loved ones who have Alzheimer's. Some of the interventions with caretakers that can be helpful is getting a diagnosis as early as possible, making sure that they know what the resources are and what they are, help them to become educated about it. It took my dad a while to understand that um, saying something over and over again isn't going to make the person with Alzheimer's remember it, um, but it is something you will need to do because in just a few seconds or minutes or hours, that information has been deleted from the server. Um, of course, educating them about getting help and self care is incredibly important. Respite care is very helpful. I know in Wisconsin there are day programs that can be helpful that provide some respite for those who are in the those folks usually are in the late, early to mid life or mid stages of Alzheimer's. As Alzheimer's progresses, it gets to the point where it's next to impossible for, unless you have many family members pitching in, to really take good care of the person around the clock. Help them manage their stress, help them to be flexible cognitively, accepting changes. Of course, legal and financial planning can be problematic. Having resources for folks around that would be very helpful. And also, it's real easy to feel bad about oneself and how you, as a caregiver, with your frustrations with the person. It's easy to feel guilty about how you've interacted with the person, and so you're going to need to provide some support and again resources for the caretaker. Moving on to the broader category of disabilities. Um, in the text, it covers, it's actually chapter 12, could be several chapters, but it's an overview. So it covers a few areas of disability, including physical or mental impairments, and discusses how these can be present at birth but can develop over time at any time. Also, historically and presently, society tends to reject or discriminate against people who are disabled. If you haven't figured that out by now in human services, you know, I'm not sure what to say. And this is where we have the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, which I'm sure you've learned about in one of your previous classes. Um, in about, let's see, oh, this is a while ago. So shortly after the ADA, one of the interesting things that came out was about a little over half of those over 65 reporting having a disability. So that tells you how, and this is only going to get bigger as the baby boomer generation ages and more disabilities pop up. So gerontology is actually a pretty good field to be going into if you're interested in that, or hospice care as well. And in terms of intervention, again, a very brief overview. Case management being probably the best form of intervention. When you're addressing Maslow's hierarchy of needs, making sure that they have food, shelter, clothing to begin with. And then moving on to safety and other things. So, case management, what sort of things does that involve? Screening, assessment goals, having meetings, organizing material, being an advocate. Oftentimes, people are anxious, are repulsed, do not know how to intervene or interact with someone who has a disability. And I know in the news you've probably seen a lot of overreactions on the part of police with folks who have disabilities. I'll include a clip in the weekly units just to kind of give you an idea of what sort of things I'm talking about here. All right, so that is chapter 12. It is a very quick overview of lots of information. Um, and it is the last chapter that you will be graded on in this course. So, good luck.